Welcome, welcome, welcome. Shortly we'll begin our webinar on an opportunity for a New South Wales Human Rights Act. It's great to have you all here. We've got a number of people joining us today, so if you could mute your microphones while you're not speaking, we greatly appreciate that. You can hear that there's some people from some very busy workplaces at the moment on the call. Great to have you all here today. We might begin because we have a limited amount of time for the webinar today, and we know that there are a number of people that will be on the call and very interested in what's discussed today. Firstly, I'd like to welcome you all warmly to this webinar, an opportunity for a New South Wales Human Rights Act. Today we have Danny Fadul, the Campaign Manager at the Human Rights Law Centre, and we've got V Blackwood, the Director of Policy, Advocacy and Research at Homelessness New South Wales. And my name's Dom Rowe, and I'm the CEO of Homelessness New South Wales. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on whose lands we're meeting today, wherever those lands might be, and I want to pay respects to elders past and present. I want to acknowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples often find their human rights breached in Australia, which is incredibly unfortunate. And there's a series of injustices, whether or not that injustice is being overrepresented in the people presenting to specialist homelessness services for assistance, or whether or not that be a lack of a treaty that's been signed in Australia. We know that these injustices exist and that we exist on land that has been stolen and has never been ceded. With that, I'd like to just talk to you about a little bit of housekeeping. I mentioned some of it at the start. If you could keep your microphone muted, we'd greatly appreciate that. If you have questions that you would like to ask, feel free to put your hand up at the end, or alternatively put your question or comment in the chat. We'll be monitoring the chat and making sure that we can interact that way. So please do that. If you have tech difficulties, just mention that in the chat and we'll also try and assist you from where we are remotely. With that, we might begin the process. And as I mentioned, we have Danny and V as our speakers today, both with some expertise in the human rights area. Firstly, I'd just like to hand to Danny and ask Danny if you could start us off at the basic level and what is a Human Rights Act, just so that we're all on the same page together.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that, Dom. Hi, everyone. So good to meet you. And I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the land of the Gadigal people and pay respects to elders past and present. Also acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. And I think the starting point is to note that human rights acts are basically a piece of legislation that lists the human rights standards that Australia has promised the world to uphold. These are the standards that you'd be familiar with: the right to education, the right to health, the right to an adequate standard of living. That includes the right to housing, freedom of expression, right to privacy, cultural rights, all of those rights listed in a single piece of legislation. And by having that in law, it's not only something that governments must be considering when they're coming up with a new law, a new policy, or running a service, but also means that people can take action when their rights are being breached. And the thing to remember about those human rights standards are that if you don't have them in law, it means that there isn't a need for government to be considering those human rights standards when they come up with a new policy. So that means I have to consider all manner of different things. How much does it cost? Did we promise this the last election? What does the polling say? What do the numbers in the parliament allow for? All of those factors, but they don't have to consider people's human rights when they're coming up with those policies. Most importantly, it means they don't have to think about those human rights when they're providing a service. So instead, you have to rely on the complicated patchwork of rights that you might have in discrimination law, specific pieces of legislation like a Privacy Act. If there happens to be human rights standards that are in the Residential Tenancies Act and other legislation in the housing space, it's complicated, it's not complete. Is it even enforceable? All of those complicated questions are out there. So what a Human Rights Act does is put all those into law and require those rights to be considered. The other bit of good news to say about a Human Rights Act is we have one currently operating at the state and territory level in Victoria since 2006, in Queensland since 2019, and the ACT since 2004. We don't have one operating in any other state or territory, and we don't have one operating at the federal level. But we also have a Human Rights Act, all similar, operating in every other Western liberal democracy. So Australia is the one missing out on having those rights at the heart of our laws.
Great, Danny. That's a really good overview, and I think really sets us off well for the rest of the conversation today. And I'm wondering if you could just go over again why you see a Human Rights Act as being important. What impact do you think it would have?
I think the first thing to say about a Human Rights Act is it's a quiet achiever. It's not something that you normally see on the front page. And the reason why is when you have better government decisions at the outset, it is rare for a government to say, we're going to make this bad decision, then we considered these human rights standards, and now we're making this better decision. We had a couple of glimpses of that during the COVID-19 pandemic when there was litigation, and the government, in effect, had to show their homework on how they come up with various laws, and they got improved because they had to look at those human rights standards in Victoria and Queensland and the ACT. But rarely do you see that happen. But what you have when you have those human rights standards in law is it means you have the ability to have a housing policy, housing services with the right to housing as the foundation for it. Right now, we have a debate on housing happening in many different ways at various tiers of government. And there's a whole bunch of important policies and points being put forward. But far too often, that debate is focused on numbers and prices, not about people. When you have a Human Rights Act, you have the ability to have a conversation focused on people rather than numbers and prices. And then the eventual policy levers and initiatives that are put forward have that foundation of human rights to improve the operation of it. The other thing to note is we know from the experience in Victoria, Queensland, and the ACT of the benefits that Human Rights Acts can provide to people across the community. And let me share with you a couple of stories. In Queensland, a domestic violence survivor was going to be evicted from her social housing because of the actions of her abusive ex-partner in breaching the lease. By using the Queensland Human Rights Act with the help of Tenants Queensland, she was able to get that eviction reversed, and she's able to stay in that property with her family. We also have the situation in Victoria where a council had its policy to evict homeless people who were sleeping in their cars in a council-run park. That policy got reversed because of reference to the Victorian Charter of Human Rights. And most recently, people may have seen the successful legal action taken by Basic Rights Queensland against Morden Council in Brisbane against a similar policy on that. Those are the sorts of benefits you can get when you have those human rights standards in law. If you do not have those human rights standards in law, you have to hope that you can get the public eye and the politicians' attention to make sure that issue gets dealt with. And as you know, when it comes to people who do not have secure housing, it is incredibly difficult to get that attention beyond a human interest vignette.
That's great, Danny. And that story, particularly in Queensland, is really important. We know that there are a number of people sleeping rough in New South Wales, and anything that can protect their ability to exist and be where they feel safe is important. So incredibly important to hear that. V, I might turn to you for a moment, and if you could tell us about the Human Rights Bill in New South Wales that's being proposed, what can you tell us about that?
I knew I would trip up on unmuting myself. Thanks, Dom. Good afternoon, everyone. So the Human Rights Bill is a members' bill that's been put forward from the Greens MP Jenny Leong. If it is passed, it would create a Human Rights Act for New South Wales. So it would have that act that respects, protects and promotes human rights and sets clear rules about when human rights can be limited. As a New South Wales Act, it would apply to everyone in New South Wales, and it would apply to the actions and decisions made by governments and public authorities. It would also apply to those actions and decisions made by other organisations if they're delivering what are called functions of a public nature. So, for example, providing public housing, they're delivering it on behalf of the government as a public service. And so the actions and decisions of those organisations would also be covered. The Act would also establish a New South Wales Human Rights Commission, which would be an organisation that's able to handle human rights complaints through conciliation and deliver education on human rights. And finally, it would set up a New South Wales Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights, which would sit within the New South Wales Parliament. And that committee would have the responsibility to look at new legislation brought forward in Parliament and review whether it's consistent with human rights. So as Nessa has mentioned in the chat, it would really hold Parliament to account within those processes as well. So that's a little bit about the new bill that's come forward.
Sophie, and I think most of the people on this call are really interested in housing and homelessness. What does it include at the moment about housing?
The bill recognises a few different rights, including the right to an adequate standard of living and housing. It says that the immediately realisable aspects of that right are everyone's ability to enjoy the right to adequate housing without discrimination, which we know for, renters. I think a lot of services on this call will have experience of advocating for clients who've been discriminated against by private landlords. It will provide protection against unlawful or arbitrary eviction so that people can't be evicted without following a proper legal, reasonable process. Protection as well against unlawful or arbitrary withdrawal of essential utility services to your home. And that can be really important, in particular for people who may have health issues, where having a continuous supply of electricity to your home is necessary to keep your medical devices running. And access to minimum essential amounts of clean water that is sufficient and safe for personal and domestic use. And that one sounds like it might be a very basic aspect of the right, but we know for too many communities, I might just
ask you all to mute if you can. There's someone that's on the call at the moment that's not muted. Thank you.
So yeah, we've heard, that far too many communities across New South Wales actually don't yet have that right to access minimum clean, safe water, which is a pretty huge failure in a wealthy country like Australia. It also recognises other rights that also touch on housing, including the right to privacy and reputation. That's a right that was used in Queensland, as Danny mentioned, to protect people who are living in tent encampments, because it recognises that those tents are their homes and therefore they have the right to not have their home, their private space, unlawfully or arbitrarily interfered with. So that's a really important way to protect people, even where they don't have what we might actually say is a proper home to live in. And it requires public authorities to act or make decisions in ways that are compatible with human rights, as well as considering human rights when they're making those decisions. So it means they need to consider, how would this policy change affect people's right to housing, their right to live somewhere in security and peace and dignity? Does it move us towards a New South Wales where more people can enjoy that right? And if not, is there a good enough reason to justify why it doesn't do that?
Right, there's lots of rights then that the New South Wales Bill touches on that are important to housing and homelessness.
Absolutely.
Great to hear. And Danny, there was a little bit of chat in the chat box there about the differences between a national and a state Human Rights Act. I wonder if you could share that with the group now about those differences as you see them.
Yeah, thank you for that. And that's a really important question, because sometimes it can be a bit confusing for folks when they are thinking about how our federation works. Because what it means is that you can have a state Human Rights Act, but that can only apply at the state government level. That means you need a federal Human Rights Act to apply at the federal level, as in like a state government can't pass a law that the federal government is bound by. So you need to have separate acts at the state level and the federal level to cover both of those tiers of government. Just to quickly note, a state act would cover local government as well as state governments, hence the Moreton Bay Council and the Port Phillip Council that I mentioned earlier in my contribution were local governments because they're bound by their state Human Rights Acts. And the importance of that is that by having a federal act at the federal level, there is a clear line of responsibility. So the federal government can't say, oh, this is something that someone else has imposed upon us. These are the laws that the federal parliament, the federal government has agreed that they will be following to make sure that those human rights have been properly considered when they come up with a new law, a new policy, new service. By having those state human rights acts and the federal human rights act in operation, you have the opportunity to ensure that when you do have overlap, such as the National Housing Homelessness Plan and how it interacts between the federal and state level, all tiers of government should be considering those human rights standards in how they're operating and how they're working with each other to make sure you don't have a situation where one tier of government's considering human rights standards properly, but the other one is not. We want to make sure that human rights standards benefit everyone across our community, regardless of their postcode or the state in which they live in. And the other thing that's worth noting as well, of course, is that human rights acts can evolve over time. When the ACT did their Human Rights Act in 2004, it didn't have the right to housing in it. That was placed into the ACT Human Rights Act last year. And the Federal Human Rights Act being considered by the federal government right now is similar to the New South Wales Private Members Bill, one that lists all of those human rights standards. So we actually are seeing that evolving and improvement of human rights standards consideration over time. And that's one of the other benefits of the Federation. We get to see what's happened at the state level and build and learn from it and expand those human rights standards based on the lessons we've learned from the earlier adapters of human rights standards.
Thanks, Danny. It sort of makes me think that the interaction between state and federal acts is like a web of human rights protection across Australia. I liked hearing you say that it wouldn't matter what postcode you were in, you would get some of the protections if we had that sufficient legal network operating in Australia. Back to you, because the New South Wales bill is on foot at the moment. I'm interested in what level of support that bill is getting at the moment and what you can tell us about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the bill it's been passed through the first reading in Parliament, so it's currently at the committee stage, which is a process in the way that laws go through Parliament, where everyone has the opportunity to make a submission, either in favour or against, or with recommendations to change it and further improve it. And that submission process is open until the 3rd of July. There's a campaign group called the Human Rights for New South Wales Alliance, and that's made up of community members campaigning to ensure that the human rights of everyone in New South Wales are respected. That alliance has a huge number of organisations working in support, and so they really celebrated the bill passing through to that committee stage. If people would like to make a submission to the committee to say that they support the bill, they see that it's important, they can make a submission until the 3rd of July. We will be making a submission and we'll share our submission out to members in advance so that people can see what we're suggesting, if you'd perhaps like to follow what we're submitting. Our suggestions will actually be around taking that right to housing even further. So we see an opportunity to require decision makers not just consider the right to housing, but to act or make decisions in ways that actively progress it. We also see other ways to protect the right to housing. Homelessness is always a breach of the right to housing. And in a wealthy country like Australia, there's no excuse for people being homeless. The government has the responsibility to ensure that everyone, at minimum, has safe emergency shelter. So the fact that there are people still rough sleeping across New South Wales and Australia is a really serious failure of human rights. And what we'll submit is that this is a way to better protect the rights of these people who are so vulnerable in our state and country at the moment.
Thanks, Fee. It does. It's pretty amazing, isn't it, that in a wealthy country like Australia, we can have over 200,000 people that don't have a place to call home and are currently struggling to find whatever pathway they can to that
That's
place.
Right. Yeah, and when we talk about the right to housing, Danny and I both use language that is a little bit technical, I suppose, that it's to be progressively realised. But that's a recognition that it does take time to ensure that everyone has the full access to the right to adequate housing. That's a home that is safe, warm, dry, secure in their tenancy. They're not going to be evicted arbitrarily. That's affordable for their needs. And while it does take time to get to that full expression, that's not a reason for the government to kind of use it as a loophole. In a wealthy country like Australia, the government has the responsibility to move everything forward as quickly as possible and to the maximum of all of their available resources until everyone fully enjoys this right.
Yeah. So one of the ways where you said that people could support the human rights bill in New South Wales was to put in a submission. Reading the submission that we put in would be one way to help you get some inspiration for what to put in that submission. That's a great way for people to be able to support that and show that there's multiple voices out there that support human rights in New South Wales and beyond. Interested, Danny, you sort of focus a lot on the federal sphere, I think, with your campaign. Could you tell us about the Human Rights Legal Centre campaign and how people might be able to support that?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Dom. And the answer to that question is, if a Human Rights Act benefits everyone across the community, then you need people across the community calling for a Human Rights Act. One of the things that we've learned is that reasons why we haven't won a Human Rights Act until now, either at the state level or at the federal level, has been fundamentally, who is the people normally talking about it? Lawyers and human rights advocates. I'm literally the Venn diagram of who normally talks about a Human Rights Act. And that's like fantastic. But the problem is that people in the community look at that and go, oh, that's really relevant for just lawyers and human rights advocates. That's not really relevant to me. Different story when you've got people with disability hearing from disability representative organisations about the benefits of a Human Rights Act when it comes to people with disability, and children's rights organisations talking about the benefits of a Human Rights Act for children, and so on and so forth. So it is so important that if we're talking about how Human Rights Act and the right to housing in the Human Rights Act in particular can help make sure everyone has a safe, secure and healthy place to call home. Representative organisations covering people who are relying on housing services, providing housing services like yourselves, speaking up about it is such an important thing. Showing those examples of how the current system is not working, how the lack of that human rights consideration is having an impact in terms of the real lives of people that you are supporting and servicing, and what difference it could make by having a Human Rights Act, having that right to housing, to be able to rely on your day-to-day work, not just with better government decisions and services, but action that you can take to help people who right now you may have to shrug your shoulders and say, I'm sorry, we can't help you. Because the other thing that's worth noting about a Human Rights Act is, as V mentioned, there's this concept called progressive realisation. But there are some rights in a Human Rights Act that are immediately realisable. Things like people shouldn't be evicted into homelessness. That is a basic standard that you would think is common sense, but that is not the current reality. People are being evicted into homelessness right now. And there should be a law that says that shouldn't be allowed. And a Human Rights Act right to housing provides something for you to turn to try and prevent something as awful as that taking place. And so that's why having organisations join the New South Wales Human Rights Act Alliance to support the New South Wales Human Rights Act campaign is fantastic. If you wish to join the Federal Human Rights Act campaign, definitely reach out because we would love to join as many organisations calling for a Human Rights Act at the federal level as possible, making a submission to the New South Wales Human Rights Act inquiry. The New South Wales Human Rights Act Alliance is shortly going to be releasing a submission guide to assist organisations to make the most impactful submissions to that inquiry, because it is an open question whether we can win a New South Wales Human Rights Act right now. This inquiry will be a key determinant whether the New South Wales government decides to support it. And of course, at the federal level, the federal government has publicly stated they are currently considering whether to support a federal Human Rights Act, because that was endorsed in a federal inquiry into a Human Rights Act that was committed to by the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights in 2024. So the big things I would say is join, submit, and then speak up. And the final one is so important is because Amnesty International has done polling on a Human Rights Act. 3 out of 4 Australians support a Human Rights Act when asked the question. 70% of Australians think we already have a Human Rights Act. 7 out of 10 people. So if you're wondering why don't we have a Human Rights Act, one reason is people think we already have one. Another reason I suspect is US cop shows, people pleading the fifth and demanding their phone call. But the third thing is, for many people, much of the time, life's pretty good for them. They think the Human Rights Act must already be in operation as part of that architecture of having a good life in a wealthy country that we live in. But the reality is that isn't there, but you only realize you don't have a Human Rights Act until it's too late. So those are the three things: join, submit, and share and speak up about a Human Rights Act so that we can make sure people across the community know that we need this Human Rights Act and what benefits it can provide, and making sure our decision makers decide to make it a reality.
Danny, I love that figure that 75% of people support a Human Rights Act. That should mean a lot more political action than we're getting at the moment. But I really liked the way that you described some of that disconnect between what people think is happening and what's actually happening. So thank you for that. Look, I think now's the time for us to turn a little bit to the audience and see what questions you have. I'm going to go through some of them that we've gotten. If you've got any others, we'll come to you in a second. But there was one here. We might just start with a cheeky one. How can Australia keep ratifying international treaties without acts that make it enforceable? What do you reckon, V and Danny? V, I might let you take it away first, and then we'll go to Danny.
Yeah, this is the age-old question, and I think any human rights lawyer, Danny's smiling, is eternally frustrated by this. Well, how can they keep doing it? Because not enough people are holding them to account or holding them responsible for following through on their promises. And that's where joining the campaign and speaking up about the importance is so critical, to push them to commit to what they've already committed to, make real what they've already committed to. Danny, over to you.
I think that you will be shocked to learn that it is really cheap to promise to uphold various human rights standards. It is exceptionally cheap and affordable to do that. It costs more to actually make them a reality. And that is the situation we have. Which government's going to say, no, we don't support the right to education and the right to health and freedom of expression and right to privacy at the international level? Like, only monsters will refuse to support that, right? So of course they're going to support that at the international level, but they do not automatically apply in Australian law. You require legislation to be passed in Australia to actually make them a reality. And it's one of the things that makes it clear for us why a Human Rights Act is a common sense measure, because we've already said yes to it. It's about actually making it real, making something that is applied properly by governments in how they operate. And the other thing that's also worth noting is it's not just situations that you'd be experiencing this. The government themselves have done in Royal Commission after Royal Commission, aged care, disability, highlighting the lack of human rights standards being a key reason why those were systemic issues when it comes to older persons in the aged care system and people with disability in so many different ways. And both of those Royal Commissions recommended human rights standards as a key way of ensuring you don't have a repeat of those systemic problems, so that you can deal with those problems real time, so they don't build up and get to the point where you need to do a Royal Commission to get to the bottom of it. So unfortunately, it's a frustration that we are promising the world to do things that we're not going to implement, but that's up to us to step up and say to our governments, to our politicians, to our leaders that they should speak up and get involved in making those human rights a reality for everyone.
Great, thanks for that, Danny. Thanks, V. Joel, I'll just check, you had your hand up before. Would you like to ask a question?
I did. Thank you, Dom. I was just madly typing into the box, but I appreciate the opportunity to ask it. Joel from the Community Housing Industry Association. So my question's from the perspective of community housing providers who in other jurisdictions have been understood to be covered by Human Rights Act in Victoria and Queensland. So questions from the perspective of organisations who will be covered by, we would expect to be covered by the Act. And a side note is we'd love that expectation to be explicit when it's introduced rather than waiting for interpretation. But in those other jurisdictions where there is not an explicit protected right to housing, the rights to housing have been read into other protected rights, privacy and some of the others. And for example, for community housing providers, that has meant implications for how the ending of tenancies and evictions, decisions on those are made by tribunals. So my question, that's a long way to get to my question, which is, with an explicit right to housing, what do you expect the implications might be for community housing providers above and beyond what would be what's understood to be protected under other protected rights?
I might ask V to answer that question first.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Joel, for that question, and really great question. You're right, it's a lot easier when law is explicit about who's covered so that there's no uncertainty for organisations, and community housing providers would be covered by this piece of legislation because it says, that's delivering services of a public nature, delivering public housing or social housing, essentially on behalf of the government and their responsibility to deliver social housing. So that's where you would be covered. And what the bill does is identify what the minimum obligations of the right to housing are. So those are the things like banning arbitrary or unlawful eviction. And so those are the core standards that community housing providers would be held to, alongside being required to consider human rights in full, not just the right to housing, but the whole web of everyone's human rights when you're developing policies, procedures, decision making that govern how you do your job. So, for instance, if you're developing a tenant obligations or tenant rules, you need to consider all of the different human rights that might apply to your tenants and how you can ensure that the tenant obligations respect those human rights.
Thanks, V. I knew you were the right person to throw that question to. I hope it's okay, Danny, we might leave it there for that one. I'm intrigued. Gordon's got his hand up, and we might throw to Gordon to see what his question is.
Yeah, hi. I've actually had a couple of experiences in taking the human rights or taking an organisation and a government department to the Human Rights Commission in Queensland. And that was a very interesting process, and it'll be interesting to hear what Danny and V have to say on how that act might apply in New South Wales. But I was, the first time I took an organisation that we felt wasn't providing an adequate standard of care for someone who they were supposed to be providing housing for, who were government funded in Queensland. And we, the Human Rights Commission found in our favour and made various undertakings that they wanted that organisation to follow through with. But the problem in Queensland, at least, is that those enforcements they're not enforceable. So everybody shook their heads, said the right thing, went off, and as far as we're aware, nothing's actually changed. Some of the things we're asking for is that they actually put in process policies around trauma-informed care. We didn't get any feedback. We still haven't had any feedback as to whether that organisation actually followed through with that. The next situation we had was actually taking a Queensland government department to the Human Rights Commission. That was actually child safety, but there's a connection because we were effectively dealing with the government department. We were told that if we really wanted to be serious about this, we actually needed to put our argument through on the basis of discrimination, because if it was held under discrimination, then it could actually be passed across to QCAT on that basis. And then if we had a favourable hearing through the Human Rights Commission and we weren't happy with the outcome, then we could take that through to QCAT, and then whatever the courts decided that could actually be enforceable. Fortunately, child safety actually came through and started providing an adequate model of care, and we had to make that hard decision at that point of time that we're really there for the child, not necessarily, to take the child safety to task. So I suppose what I'm saying is that Human Rights Commission is a fantastic act. If it was enforceable, it would be absolutely brilliant. But unfortunately, our experience is that we've found an awful lot of, especially government organisations, treat it with contempt because it's not enforceable. I mean, the way child safety, their behaviour through that human rights hearing was absolutely deplorable. And, you know, they admitted it themselves at the end. I mean, they sent a Queen's Counsel to something that's supposed to be a mediation process. So I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts on how that might come through in New South Wales, and also, you know, for everybody else out there, how best we actually do take these people to task through this process.
Daniel, I'll
me
give you a chance to answer.
Yeah, I'll dive in. Thanks so much for that, Gordon. So I think there's an important thing to remember about how the Queensland and Victorian Acts operate. That's not the case in ACT, and I'll come to that in a second. And that is that both of them say, in order to avoid the lawyer's picnic concern that's raised about putting human rights standards into law, that lawyers will run amok, they both of them said that you can only go to court to enforce the rights in the Queensland and Victorian Human Rights Acts if there's another law that you can point to that is being breached at the same time. So discrimination law, also Human Rights Act, or the residential tenancies legislation, and also the Human Rights Act can then be brought in as a consequence. You can't just use the Human Rights Act alone as the cause of action to go to court in Victoria and in Queensland. In the ACT, you can. You can go directly to court to enforce the ACT Human Rights Act without trying to find another law that's also being breached by that public authority. So, and ACT has not seen like a dramatic explosion of cases in their courts. Instead, what you've seen is the conciliation process taken more seriously because the public authority realises there's the ability for court action to happen if they're not taking that conciliation process seriously and coming up with a sensible solution to the issue that's being raised. So that, I think, is the experience you're finding. The New South Wales bill has a direct cause of action. You can go directly to court to enforce the provisions of the New South Wales Human Rights Act that's been proposed. We'll see what the ultimate result will be, whether that will still be the case, but we support making sure you can go to court to raise a issue of that Human Rights Act not being complied with, and for a conciliation process, arbitration in a civil administrative tribunal as a way of providing a low-cost way to resolve those issues. But I want to go back to the 101 examples we compiled in Victoria, Queensland, and the ACT. The vast majority of those did not involve court actions or tribunals or even conciliation. The majority of those examples are of people raising it with the decision maker, with the support of an advocacy group or community organisation, the decision maker realising that they didn't properly consider human rights standards and changing their decision. Does that work all the time? Of course not. You want to have a situation where people can go to court, but it's fair to say that a lot of change can happen because you have those human rights standards there, where right now you don't have that. And so as a result, what do you raise when you're having your rights being breached by a housing provider, by a government agency or authority? So that's the answer. Your question about the New South Wales one. The federal one that's being considered also has a direct cause of action to courts if you can't have the matter conciliated initially by the Human Rights Commission.
Thanks, Danny. And look, I might do one of the questions from the chat now. Loma, I'll come to you after that. So if you could just hold your horses for a little bit. Shirley's interested in how would the Act improve outcomes for children and young people experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity in New South Wales. And V, I might ask you to respond to that question if you can.
Absolutely. And thanks, Shirley. This is a really fantastic question. So what the bill would do, or what the Act would do, is require decision makers to consider people's human rights when they're making decisions. And children and young people are called out in the Act as a group that have particular rights So children and young people have the right to housing. Everyone has the right to housing, but children have additional rights to be protected because they are so vulnerable. They have the rights to be protected, to be part of that family group, to have that family connection respected. And that's not just a nuclear family, but your broader kinship connections. And so it would be a way, again, as Danny's said, to hold decision makers to account, to say, your decisions at the moment are not adequately considering the human rights of children and young people who are experiencing homelessness or at risk. So you need to go back to the table again and reconsider, redevelop those decisions in ways that actually protect people's rights. So that's, one of the ways is really that accountability mechanism to hold decision makers to protecting the rights of the people that they're making policies about and making decisions about.
Thanks, Fee. We might now go to Loma.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I've been sending a lot of things on the chat, but I'm quite passionate about this. So I have a couple of questions. So the first thing is, has there been any kind of economic modeling to show what Australia would look like with a proper Human Rights Act versus without? The reason I ask is because we've had quite a bit of success with that in the disability industry. Like, we've actually done a few modeling around thriving kids implementation versus staying with the NDI's early childhood approach, and proved that it's actually more expensive to go with thriving kids. And we've had a few success around like modeling the cost transfer to the states and all of that. So that's the first question. And the second question is, are there currently any tools that can help people make submissions? And again, with the disability industry, we've made an AI tool that helps people make submissions into the inquiry on the NDIS Amendment Act. And as a result of that, there's been over 4,500 submissions, which is historical for an inquiry. So those are my two questions.
Danny.
Thanks for the questions, Lorna. So in terms of the second bit, as I mentioned, the New South Wales Human Rights Act Alliance is about to finalise a submission guide to help organisations and individuals make submissions. So that is coming very, very soon. And that will provide that assistance for folks with like the resources, the tools, suggested things to highlight and structure, because this isn't the first time there's been an inquiry into Human Rights Acts. There's been lessons learned about what's been the most useful information to provide, the most effective ways of highlighting the need for a Human Rights Act in past inquiries. So that is coming down the path. It won't be an AI tool, but I think that's probably just as well, because in my opinion, for this one, it's about quality. It's about making sure people are sharing their stories of why we need a Human Rights Act and what difference a Human Rights Act would make for the work that you're doing, for the stories you're dealing with, for the clients you're supporting and the like. On the first element in terms of modelling, there isn't modelling on what difference a Human Rights Act would make, but I can give you one number. The Disability Royal Commission cost $500 million and went for about 4 years. That is an incredible amount of money to be spending. And there's a good reason for it, because the issues had built up to such an extent that it needed all of those resources and time to dive in, to figure out all the various ways in which people with disability have not had their rights respected in so many different spaces at the federal and state level, leading to a report which is 14 volumes. Like, if you want a pocket library, get the final report of the Royal Commission into Disability. So we don't have modelling, but my view is it's about the benefits for people across the community. Everyone should have a safe, secure place to call home. Everyone should have quality healthcare regardless of bank balance. Every child should have a great education regardless of postcode. Those are the sort of values which our community has consistently said they support and prioritise. A Human Rights Act is about putting those into reality for everyone across our community. And that, I think, is the most effective way of how we can make it. Modelling, if government wishes to do that modelling, I look forward to it, because I bet it will show that there are benefits by making better decisions at the outset and not having to deal with the consequences of poor decision making. The final thing I'd say is there's the Right to Housing report that I posted in the chat, shows that over a 10-year period, implementing the right to housing in Wales saved more money over that 10-year period by implementing that right to housing properly, they're not, because of the improved employment, education situation, by the reduction in the use of health services, by the reduction in people having to deal with various elements of the criminal law system. All of those benefits flowed on because people had a safe, secure place to call home and were able to build their lives and thrive as a consequence. So there is some modelling from Wales, but my view is modelling a Human Rights Act is useful, but the more important thing is the stories you can share.
We've done that.
Thanks, Danny. I might have to, sorry, Loma, we've just reached time, so we might have to leave it there. But if you've got any other questions, put them in the chat, and we'll make sure that in the Homelessness New South Wales newsletter, we answer those in our next edition. Also, if you want any resources about the Human Rights Act at a federal or state level, they're available in the chat for you as well. And I'd also finally encourage you to become members of Homelessness New South Wales. If you're interested in more events like this, we run them quite regularly and try to keep the community as informed as we can. But you can access our membership form from our website at homelessnessnsw.org.au. With that, thank you very much to our speakers, Danny and V. It's been great having you on board. There were lots of really good questions. I think people were quite interested in this topic. Let's hope that they can add their support to the campaign going forward. Thanks for your time.